Hi, good evening. I'm Paul Sunderland, and I'm really pleased to be doing this lecture. This is the third time that I've done the lecture here for LifeWorks, so really pleased to donate it to the free lecture series. Yes, what I really want to be able to do is just talk to you guys directly about this. There's something about PowerPoint or anything overhead that actually somehow divides the attention, and it seems to me that the issue of adoption is all about divided attention. It's all about two sets of families. It's all about the conflicting feelings of wanting to belong and yet fearing belonging. It's all about sort of twos, and so it seems right to do this lecture just like talking to you. I hope that you agree with that when I finish talking. My aim is, actually it's not particularly my speciality, talking about adoption and addiction. I'll tell you a little bit about how I got interested in it. But it is actually something I'm really passionate about. This is the third time I've done this talk. I've talked at a couple, I probably do a lecture like this on this topic twice a year. Once here and once usually at some addiction conference or symposium. And I'm always really pleased to do it. The first time I did it to a group of professionals, I was given a slot at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning. And actually, we filled the room with people who came up afterwards and said, well, actually, I'm adopted. Have all these, and my aim was, what I want to do, I'm an expert, I'm going to share some of my experience, some of my colleagues' experience about working with this particular group of people. And I guess what I want to do is to stimulate thought and just heighten awareness. And I'm up for questions and complaints, and let's sort of see how it goes at the end. Perhaps the first thing to tell you about adoption is it's a pretty weird word, because it's about the only condition that doesn't really describe what's happened. We talk about now. If somebody has a bipolar disorder, we don't talk about them as sort of people who are trying to get a bit stable. If people even nowadays, we think about learning difficulties, we tend to politically correctly call them learning differences. But we stick to talking about what it's about. What I want to suggest to you guys is that actually talking about adoption is a denial, for starters. It is a denial of relinquishment, because that is the wound. What I propose to talk to you about, what I propose to tell you, if you don't know it already, is that I believe that the relinquishment wound, or wounds, as I hope to explain, actually can be seen as a post-traumatic stress disorder, a developmental post-traumatic stress disorder. That is the wound, not what happens. Now, the problem is the word adoption there's quite a cover-up in that sense. So that actually adoptive, when we think about the adoption triangle, we think about the three parties in adoption. There is the adopted child, the relinquished child. There are the birth or natural parents, depending which sort of political speak you want to use, and there is the adoptive parent, the adoptive family, this triangle. Now, I am going to talk mostly about the adopted child, and particularly about the adoptive child who also has the co-occurring disorder of addiction or addictive disorder. I don't have a lot of experience of birth parents. I have come across them in the treatment setting. I think the ones that I've come across, actually, what they usually say is not a day goes by when I don't think of what happened. I think there are particular problems. I'm sure they do turn up in the treatment environment. I became interested in this subject because actually adoptees are overrepresented in treatment. They are massively overrepresented, and we have to start thinking, why is that? Why is that? I meet quite a few adoptive parents these days, particularly with the cross-cultural adoptions that have become so popular, who come into my office just tearing their hair out, thinking, this is just not what we signed up to. What is going on? I have a bit of experience of that, and I will talk about some of that. I also don't really want to talk too politically about adoption, because actually the point is that the point that I want to make is that actually there is no adoption, there's no relinquishment without trauma. I don't want to get into any arguments about whether it should happen or shouldn't happen or any of that. I think what I want to hold in mind is there is no adoption without trauma. There's no relinquishment without trauma. And that there's something about... So what I'm going to be talking about is an enormous grief. It's the grief of a child, of a baby who has been waiting 9 months to meet somebody who they're not going to meet. And I'll tell you something about what happens in utero and how we're set up, how we are set up to bond. I'm going to talk about, this is about the enormous grief of the mother, sometimes father as well, but the mother who cannot live with having a child. Very often young, very often influenced by parents, patriarchal society who are saying, look, you can't do this. Or perhaps even our family can't have this. Who goes against her biology. And it's about the enormous grief. So the enormous grief of somebody who can't live with having a child, and the enormous grief of someone who can't live without having a child. Now, to be careful about generalizing. But very often, adoptive parents who come into the adoption field come with an enormous grief. They've been unable to have a child. And actually, this is the problem I find with this word adoption, because it sort of covers up their grief. So very often we think in terms of people who are adopted as actually having been, well, you hear these words, and I'm going to read some client material out later, some letters that people have written, and very often they're told they were chosen. That somehow they've been selected. But actually, very often it's about somebody who enters into a family that doesn't genetically fit for them. It's about somebody entering a family that doesn't genetically fit with an impossible job description. The job description of having to be somebody that they can never actually be, to fix a wound. Now the problem, some of you will know, and I know from counselling couples where there are issues of infertility, that is an enormous disappointment. We get together, we couple in the expectation that actually, if we have sex, we're going to have kids. And we think about that, and that's part of it. It's part of the couple sort of contract, consciously and unconsciously. So there's an enormous grief when that can't happen, and there's an enormous disappointment too. The feelings of, well, actually, I married you so that we could do this, but you can't. Do I stay? How do we manage this? What does this mean? An enormous grief that I think very often has got covered up. Now, I'm going to be talking to you about an experience of working with adoptees who were adopted 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's very different today. It's very, very different today, and people are far more prepared for this. But the people that are turning up in our consulting rooms that start to get us interested in what on earth is going on here, these are people who often come to the adoptive family with no idea of their history. Sometimes they're not allowed to find out. And for some of them, and I can tell you, I'll be talking about one case perhaps, who didn't find out she was adopted until she was about to get married and discovered that her birth certificate was different. And on going to Somerset House, discovered that actually what that meant. So people, it's very different now. What we do have now is these sort of the cross-cultural adoptions, I think, are really fascinating that we're seeing. Because I think that... And those people are starting, these are the girls and boys of 20 or 25 who are starting to turn up in the consulting rooms, with severe addiction, with parents who are tearing their hair out, thinking, but we've done everything for them. We sent them to boarding school, with no sense that actually there might be some repetition of an abandonment. And I hear stories, I hear stories of people going off to boarding school, running down drives, holding onto car door handles. Because actually, for the adoptee, the issue of abandonment is life-threatening. That is it. Can we imagine? Is there a bigger trauma than being separated from your mother, the one person you need at the beginning of life? I think not. I think not. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that this stuff, which is pre-verbal, it can't be recalled, is remembered. It is remembered. We have an adoption triangle, but I'm going to talk about the adopted child. Now, the other thing is, or the relinquished child. So let's bear in mind, here we have this very interesting term that covers up what's happened for everybody, that makes out that actually everything's going to be happy ever after. Here we have a situation where there is an enormous grief for everybody. Enormous grief for everybody. The human infant, the thing about the human brain is that the human infant is born, the human brain starts working before it's built. Unlike your computer that you might have bought, that in theory comes with an operating system and it's ready to go, the human brain starts working before it's built. So experience is the architect of the brain. We have over 100 billion neurons at birth, just waiting to get cues from experience to connect up. and start to Alan Shaw, the neuropsychologist, the famous neuropsychologist, whose books are impossible to read, but if there's one quote you need to know, really, what he says that, neurons that fire together wire together. Our early experiences, those neurons are just waiting, 100 billion neurons, just waiting to get cues from experience to join up. So what I'm going to be suggesting to you is that actually, at the beginning of life, if life begins with a trauma, then actually, and that trauma feels life-threatening, and that trauma is about separation and abandonment, those neurons are going to fire. Now, the human brain is a reflective organ. It constantly reflects on past experience and thinks about, without us knowing, unconsciously, when have I come across this before and how do I respond? So I think it will be little wonder that for a lot of adoptees, there is a real sense of a real fear of abandonment in relationships, an enormous, this contradictory need, this desire to attach, this hunger to attach that is so strong that has people acting against their best interests, but with the contradictory feeling of, God, this is not safe. Because if the first most significant person in your life gives you up, how do you know the next one isn't going to do just that? How do you know that the next one won't do that? So we're talking about this very early wound that cannot be remembered. And again, the points that I want to make to you, there are three important points about this trauma. Firstly, that there is a trauma. Okay? Secondly, that it can't be remembered, or actually can't be recalled. It is remembered in implicit memory systems, in the limbic system that is online. The frontal cortex isn't online. The frontal cortex that actually takes most people to therapy and has people thinking about things and doing CBT and all that sort of stuff, that's just not around for the first sort of 5-6 years of life. But we have a trauma that can't be recalled, and we have a trauma that happens at the beginning of life, which means, as I hope I'll remember to tell you later, that there is no pre-trauma personality. If you think about, if you have a trauma, the whole field of trauma started actually as a result of following up the Vietnam vets, in the 60s and 70s. That's when, and the whole notion of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that starts to, all the studies are really about the Vietnam vets. It's then you start thinking about accidents, it's assaults, more recently we're thinking about sexual abuse. Actually, it is yet to there's yet to be a category of developmental post-traumatic stress disorder. There's yet to be a category, and I think you'll realise that there needs to be. But the difference is, if you have a trauma, if you're in a pile-up on the M25, and you feel like, God, there's no way I'm getting in a car again, this is just too frightening, I'm certainly not going near the M25. You have a trauma that actually starts to change the way that you are and the way you function. You will know, if you seek help for that trauma, if you go with PTSD, you will know that at some point you were okay and you could drive a car on the M25. If you have so you have what we call a pre-trauma personality. If you have a trauma at the beginning of your life, you don't have that. So that I think one of the problems that people with these early psychological wounds have is that they believe that their adaptive post-traumatic stress behaviour, the need, all the feelings that I'll talk about later, the feelings of shame and anxiety and unworthiness and unlovableness, they believe that that is part of them because there is nothing to compare it to. Because there was no driving on the M25 before this happened. Now, the other interesting thing about, again, I think because we call it adoption, there tends to be, although not always, there tends to be one adoption. If you think about relinquishments, actually, I want to put it to you that there are nearly always more than one, and sometimes, coming across in our clinical practice, 5, 6, 7 relinquishments. So you think about being given up by natural mother at birth, relinquishment number 1. Sometimes cases of premature birth, so into maybe an incubator. If you're in an incubator, that is a containing environment that you adapt to. It is a relinquishment when you leave that place. That becomes your world. If you're given up into foster care, okay, you've got another relinquishment. You then you may be adopted, you might go to another foster family. You're getting the idea. This is not just one trauma. This is a series. And so certainly I've worked with people who've been adopted and actually it hasn't worked out and they've then gone back. They've been given back because this one didn't really fit. To be back into foster care and to be adopted again. So there might be one adoption, but there are many relinquishments. The cross-cultural adoptions that we're seeing, we're talking about people who are born in enormous poverty, usually in South America, who go straight into an orphanage, okay? So you have first relinquishment from mother into the orphanage, then into some sort of foster care or foster family, second relinquishment. Then these middle-class Europeans come over, check you out, and you're back, and then you're taken over here. So you think about, what we know about the human infant? The human infant can detect different smells within 24 hours of birth. We know that the human infant can we know this from experiment, can detect mother's breast milk on a pad of 10 different mother's breast milks. Within 24 hours will show a preference. Now, how do you know that they're showing a preference, people say? Well, we know it from responses, respiration, sucking, head turning. These are valid experiments. We know. So you think about, we know that the human infant, the last 2 months of pregnancy, the human infant can actually hear sounds. There have been some great experiments. We know that the experiments in the States, in Washington, had mothers reading The Cat in the Hat, okay? Quite frequently in the last 2 months of pregnancy. The babies, these are mothers who weren't giving up their children, okay? The babies showed a preference to The Cat in the Hat as opposed to any other reading. A preference, indicated by respiration, head turning, and sucking responses. Now, we also know they showed a preference for mother reading The Cat in the Hat. Okay? So we're talking about a bonding that starts very early on. We're talking about being dressed up and ready to meet somebody. Ready to smell that breast milk, ready to find that breast. Because the human baby, as you probably know, can't see to save their lives. But it can certainly smell the way to the teat. Ready to meet someone. And we think about that then going. And we think about that maybe going more than once. That is, it is enormous. Now, the sort of flavour in psychotherapy at the moment, the sort of flavour of the last few years has been attachment theory, that some of you may be studying this sort of stuff and you'll know about attachment theory and Bowlby talking about attachment theory. And it seems extraordinary now that up until the sort of 50s and 60s, nobody really realised that actually there was an inbuilt system that motivated humans and indeed ducklings and puppies and kittens, to seek proximity to their caregivers. Now it just seems so obvious, doesn't it? And Bowlby's work in the 50s and 60s had an enormous influence. Before, actually, one of the big things that it changed was allowing parents to go to hospital with children. There used to be, and some of you, those of you who have studied, there are some really shocking black and white footage of these, you've seen them, of these kids that are just, abandoned. Because actually, the human animal, but many other animals, what will they do in the absence of mother? They will make a lot of noise. People who are adopted, they often tell this story that apparently I just cried and cried. Apparently I just cried and cried. Well, is it surprising? Is it surprising? I just cried and cried. What's interesting about Bowlby's work, which strangely had to go all the way out to the States and do a lecture tour for it to then come back and be taken seriously over here, it's been developed a lot further. There's a lady called Mary Ainsworth, and then in the 90s, an American psychologist called Mary Main. And she did some really interesting research, which is also important for people, for adoptees, because one of the fears, I think, is that if you have a difficult early life experience, how are you going to be as a parent? We know that an awful lot of adults come and say, you know what, my mum did this with me, I do completely the opposite. My dad did this, I did completely the opposite. But we also know that 180 degrees from sick is not resolved. It's just 180 degrees. It's some place in the middle. And what Mary Main was talking about, she was suggesting from her studies that the emotional stability of the human child is 75% dependent on the parent, particularly the mother, being able to know herself. What Mary Main talks about is being an emotionally coherent story. If the mother can tell an emotionally coherent story, I'd say emotionally coherent story about herself and her life, if the mother can do that, then actually the child has a very, very good chance of being well balanced, which I think is really another really important thing, because for a lot of adoptees, see, I became interested in this. I trained as an addictions counsellor about 20 plus years ago. We had the manager of the unit that I worked in, I discovered, was adopted. There were 4 trainees. We were working on a work placement for a year. There were 4 trainees, and one of the other trainees was adopted. Well, that's a bit interesting, too. The next year of trainees, there was one who was adopted. Now, I don't think I really took much notice of that, other than I clocked it. I'd met a girl once at university who told me she was adopted, and frankly, I thought she was making rather a lot of it. And I think I remember saying something like, well, look, you can't remember, you're only a baby. The sort of stuff, the old lie that people tell, which in a sense is a logical one, but actually it's a nonsense. Because actually it can be remembered, it just can't be recalled. So we just start to notice this. And I remember sitting in case conferences talking about people 15 years ago even, and you were hearing a story, and somewhere there might be, and he was adopted, along with a whole lot of other stuff. Yeah? And when I started working in private practice, which I did sort of just in bits and pieces, and I was still connected to a treatment centre, I'd start to hear, and actually I started to hear it again, and somehow start to take it, say, wait a minute, there's something going on here. And start to think, and start, the first things that we start to notice is that the people who were adopted were very often presenting as really quite put together. So one of the things that we often do at the beginning of a treatment episode, an outpatient treatment episode, is to give people a bank of psychometric tests. You'd be measuring maybe anxiety or levels of depression. We started to notice that these people who had come along, not because they were adopted, by the way, they tended to be in outpatient settings, certainly addicts, because that's sort of what I do, but mostly I would categorise them as love addicts, who had come to therapy in that small window between the end of one relationship and the beginning of another one. That small window when you can actually talk some sense. Okay? That small window when you are withdrawing from the drug, because you think about love addiction. Love addiction is the need to regulate mood, isn't it, by having the positive regard of a significant other. You know, it's about, like all addictions, addiction is all about anxiety and shame. It's about regulating anxiety by having the positive regard of someone else. And it sort of works for a while, and then it doesn't. And it's that point in which they tip into some depression and think, I want to come and have some therapy. And you know what? Very rarely talk about the fact that they're adopted. It's usually, I remember, I'll read a piece of client material from somebody who I remember them saying, at the end of taking a history, by the way, I was adopted. By the way, I was adopted. As if somehow it wasn't relevant. You know, just sort of, shocking. But what was also interesting about this client group is a lot of them, when you measure their levels of depression, on a BDI, Beck's Depression Inventory, an international sort of psychometric to measure depression, and for which if you were over about a score of about 22, you probably want to have a serious chat about maybe taking some antidepressant medication. These people are scoring up near the sort of 30s, and yet you wouldn't see it. Most people, when they turn up depressed, you can see severe depression in your, it's held, isn't it, in the body. You can see it. These are people who are actually really quite together. And actually, you do the psychometric, and it's like, there's something wrong here, So you start to think, something is going on. And I started to talk to some of my colleagues about it, and we started to pay some attention. And I probably have an experience of maybe about 100 adoptees. And you have to be very careful about extrapolating from personal experience. But actually, when I talk to other people, and when I talk to the real experts, the people that are adopted, you start to realise that actually, there's an awful lot that these people have in common. And it's the point in which I started to get interested in thinking about this in some sort of as a trauma. But love addiction, my sense is, I mean, adoptees are turning up. Now, of course, the thing about addiction is, isn't it? What we know about addiction is addiction is genetically proposed and environmentally disposed. We don't know how much, but we know that there is a genetic proposition. Doesn't mean that everybody who has a parent who's an addict is going to be an addict, but genetically proposed, environmentally disposed. So for a lot of adoptees, actually, they've got bits of both these things. Now, also, of course, many people are given up for adoption because of substance misuse or alcohol misuse issues. So there's going to be, somewhere there is going to be a genetic proposition. But I think then on top of that, if we start thinking about, you know, the trauma of being given up at birth from the one person that you need to feel safe at a time that you are most helpless, you know, it is no surprise to me. It is no surprise to me that adoptees are overrepresented in treatment. So what we also know from traumatology is that actually where there is mother-infant bonding, it has an enormous impact on brain chemicals and neurotransmitters. So we know that actually levels of cortisol and adrenaline in trauma are really raised. Anywhere they're raised. Whatever trauma you're going to have, you know, when it's happening, you're going to get some shots of adrenaline and shots of cortisol. We know with mother-infant bonding, you're going to get that, but also reduced levels of serotonin. So we're talking about people who very early on have very different chemicals in their systems. Okay? And then hold in mind that it won't be just one relinquishment. Hold in mind the sense that, you know, if the baby could speak, I've been relinquished, gosh, here I am, I'm somewhere else, you know, I don't know these voices, I'm getting used to them, I'm being fed, I'm still alive. The human infant instinctively knows without care that he or she will die. And then that suddenly changes again. It suddenly changes, and the voices change, and the smells change. Again, the cross-cultural thing is a real problem because the smell is so acute. You know, frankly, South America just smells different to the UK. You know, it's for so many different reasons. We eat different things, we perspire different smells, or a cultural, you know, there's a whole lot of stuff. It's just like, where am I? But we know when this stuff happens, we know that adrenaline goes up and cortisol goes up. We know that when adrenaline goes up and cortisol goes up, that concentration and focus, okay, are affected. Which is why it is no surprise, if you talk to Nancy Verrier, who's a big writer on all of this in the States, she says that 90% of adoptees are diagnosed with what? ADD, absolutely, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Because actually what's happening is they're living on red alert. My life nearly ended. There was a trauma. I'm going to jolly well make sure it doesn't happen again. All of this, very unconscious. I will make a mental note to not get into this situation again. Right, here are these people. What do I need to do? What do you have to do to get on and belong around here? Okay? And the slow loss of self. The slow loss of self and the belief that I can't be myself in relationship because the first time I was, it was pretty disastrous. Yeah? I'm going to have to be hypervigilant. I'm going to have to live on red alert. Okay. Now, the problem with all of this, more adrenaline, more cortisol, affects sleep regulation, gastrointestinal problems, which is why so many adoptees talk to me about having stomach issues, and particularly having had them as children as well. You know, real difficulties just managing mood. What we also know is serotonin levels go down. Now, serotonin, as you probably know, is a substance in the modern antidepressants that they're trying to keep in the brain. So that, you know, all these drugs, the fluoxetine or Prozac as it's known, is what's called a serotonin, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which basically means you're taking a drug that is stopping your body from using up its own serotonin. It's you're taking a drug that is trying to make the most of the serotonin you have in order to help you feel good. Well, serotonin is about soothing. You know, if you have low levels of serotonin, it's about actually, you know, it's very hard to feel soothed. So again, think about addiction and the need to self-soothe, you know, which begins, I hear it so often in terms of issues around, and awful shame around early compulsive masturbation, early use of sweets, of sugar, these attempts to self-soothe that later on become attempts to self-soothe, I suggest, with alcohol, drugs, the financial addictions, eating disorders, and the sex and love addictions. There is a need to self-soothe. Serotonin is done. The other thing about low levels of serotonin is that serotonin is the sort of stuff that helps you manage shame. It's the sort of drug that it's the drug in our system that actually, when we're feeling pretty awful about ourselves, can say, actually, it's okay. And then when the levels are low, we don't have a defense against that. When the levels are low, it's not okay and I'm not okay. So we know, and this stuff is known, we know that trauma creates this stuff. We know that failed mother-infant bonding creates this stuff. So we're talking about people who are actually, in a sense, are sort of chemical factories from quite early on in their lives. So no surprise that actually I have people in my office who actually get quite hooked on adrenaline. Because in a sense, they need to keep it. Because actually what's happening is that the adrenaline, they've had these shots of adrenaline, and as it goes down, they feel like there's something, they go into withdrawal. I've had people who swim with the sharks. Do you know, it doesn't seem like a normal thing to do. Maybe once, but not to do it more than once. People doing all sorts of dangerous sports, putting themselves in dangerous situations. I suggest that these people are trying to regulate their levels of adrenaline and cortisol. They're trying to create some stress to manage mood, to manage mood. So here we have it. We have a trauma, an early trauma, enormous, a whole bunch of chemicals that are around that actually give sleep disturbance, stop mood regulation, gastrointestinal problems, actually are also associated with things like rashes and some nervous disorders. The evidence isn't completely clear, but there certainly seem to be some associations with sort of skin disorders and stuff like that. We have this trauma that cannot be remembered. Okay? Or cannot be, I keep saying that, can't be recalled. So there's a real sense, and actually when you talk to, in my session, I have a few people that record the psychotherapy sessions with me. I always feel slightly anxious about litigation and that sort of thing. But you know what? The only ones that ever do are adoptees. And one of the reasons is because actually when they're talking about their trauma, actually we're talking about it in the session. When they go, it's just gone from their minds. There is some link to it not being possible to recall it. So actually it's part of their creativity. So I've given up my fear of litigation. And and people will write out notes and all sorts of things from the sessions because so there's a link between a pre-verbal wound and the inability to recall a session when you're talking about that stuff. I think that's fascinating. I really do. There's all sorts of other interesting links. I have, you see, of course, some people aren't given up at birth. The other thing is some people are given up maybe at 2 weeks. I had a client who was given up at 11. I think it was 11 days, and was talking to me about getting into recovery, lots of relapsing, starting with good intentions, working with sort of bottom lines and food plans, particularly in her case, and some big DA issues, trying to keep her figures and all of that. And just said to me, but you know what happens? I managed, but somewhere, around about 2 weeks, I just give up on myself. What is she saying? This is somebody who was given up on. My feeling is there has to be a connection. And when you listen to the words, once you're tuned into it, when you listen to the words, it's too real. So there's so much for me, there's so much evidence. There's so much evidence that there is a trauma of relinquishment, that there's so much evidence that actually these chemicals in the brain start to be very different for people who have early psychological wounds, and that they take an enormous amount of management. But also, of course, we get the hypervigilance, the anxieties that go with all of that, the constant anxiety. Again, an awful lot of adoptees are presenting with some really catastrophic thinking. The sort of thinking that, they receive an envelope with some writing on they don't recognise. It's going to be a complaint or a confrontation of some kind. Do you know? The very, very easily being able to be just tipped into catastrophic thinking. Because the wound, remember, the wound was a life-threatening one. So actually, that's why things can feel so catastrophic. Whatever is happening that doesn't feel right it has a life-threatening quality to it. Now, we've also got all the stuff around shame. So shame and anxiety, as you guys will know, I think, that shame and anxiety were underpinning addictions. So shame is anxiety, the world is not a safe place. They'll push you when you're falling, stab you when you're down, kick you when you're down, better not tell it, be vulnerable, don't show who you really are, keep yourself to yourself. If you want to get anything done, do it yourself, okay? At its extreme. Everyone needs some anxiety, by the way, otherwise we wouldn't sort of run away from man-eating tigers and stuff like that. But people with early psychological wounds have it in bucketfuls. Shame, okay? Shame is the feeling I'm not good enough. It's the bad baby. It's the I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm flawed. There's something wrong with me. I better not tell anybody. How do I need to be in order to be accepted? Because being me isn't okay. So these are feelings that actually, when you talk to people with addictions, they're around for all addicts. What I want to suggest to you is that people with these early wounds have them probably volume 10 as opposed to 9.5, like the rest of the addicted population. Okay, they're very high. And actually, I think one of the reasons that the 12-step programs have been so successful is that actually, despite them being called spiritual programs, actually, I think they're shame and anxiety management programs. The 12-step program is a mood-altering program. But it's one that actually mood alters by keeping you in reality. But I think that's why it's been so successful, is along with the whole notion of fellowship and buddying and having a sense of meaning. But ultimately, they're shame and anxiety management programs. And all addictions are about shame and anxiety. All addictions are about shame and anxiety. The biggest addiction that we're seeing at the moment is the eating disorder, orthorexia, which you may know, the unhealthy obsession with unhealthy eating. The fixation about must do this, that, or the other. It's going to be 9 almonds, not 8, on the porridge or whatever. It's all about managing anxiety, an attempt to manage an insecurity in here, an anxiety in here by managing things elsewhere. Workaholism, religiosity, these things are all about, anxiety and shame management. As long as I keep busy, as long as I'm busy, then I don't have to actually feel anxious. I can focus my anxiety on the job that I've got to get done by 9 o'clock tonight. Okay? Addictions become places to put anxiety and give it another meaning, to make the inexplicable explicable. You see it a lot with people in the debtors, the compulsive debtors, for whom actually recovering from the debting addiction does not happen after a few days of detox. That you can work with people who maybe for 3 or 4 or 5 years have a debt payment plan, are trying to keep their figures, trying to pay off vast amounts of debt that they've suddenly got themselves into. Again, all about trying to manage self-esteem by spending money and all of that. And when they come towards the end, there's been a sense for them that, gosh, when I've paid my debt off, everything's going to be okay. And they really, really believe this. And what starts to happen is that actually when the end is in sight, they start to get really anxious. Very often sabotage and create another debt. But right towards the end get really anxious because actually the anxiety doesn't belong to the money. It's just found the stage. Money is just a stage for it to play itself out. And it sort of works because it's a way, that's how we get on with our lives. If you suffer, addiction is enormously creative. It's not just destructive. There's a creativity. It's an attempt to contain. Because all the time I'm worried about, this money, at least I can get on and do some other stuff. So I'm not quite sure where we've gone with that. But we're talking about volume 10, shame and anxiety, aren't we? That's what we're talking about, right from early life. Now, the thing about the shame for adoptees is that it's what we call the bad baby syndrome. The sense that somewhere, if I was given up by my mother, I don't have value. Okay? Now, if we think about that, again, it's an attempt by the infant. This is a hypothesis, by the way. We have no idea whether this is actually what happens, because you can't measure this in the laboratory yet. But it's an attempt by the infant to explain the unexplainable, if you like, or explain the unacceptable by saying, it's my fault. It's the same thing that you see with child sexual abuse. 99% of victims of child sexual abuse think that in some way it was their fault. There is something in the mind that feels like this was so fucking out of control, this was so disorganized, that I'm going to try and organize it myself by actually at least making myself responsible, because then at least I can sort of manage and get on with other parts of my life. Freud talked about His Majesty the baby. I guess we'd take issue with it. It would be Her Majesty the baby if we're writing about it now, but that's what Freud talked about. The enormous self-centeredness of the human infant, who up until the age of about 9 or 10 believes that everything that happens to them happens because of them. That's just how it is developmentally. So remember this, the human brain, there's no frontal cortex, it starts working before it's built. It's not really built at around age 20, and most of you will know that, and those of you who have teenagers know that they behave as if they've all got personality disorders, because actually, because the brain is just not fully there. It's not fully there. So Freud talks about His Majesty the baby. So on top of any possible bad baby syndrome hypothesis, you've got this idea that it's my fault. I had this when I was doing training. I did family therapy training. I often tell this story because it was one of those stories that actually just confirmed what I was sort of learning about. I was with a family. Dad was an alcoholic. The parents were separating. They had a family therapy session to talk about Dad was newly in recovery. The children had started talking a little bit. The youngest child was 7. The oldest one was 14, and there was one in the middle about 12, 3 girls. And they were talking about what was happening, what had been happening, and the fact that Mum and Dad were going to separate, and this is how it was going to be, and where everybody was going to live. And in many ways, a very responsible way to be dealing with a really difficult situation. The 7-year-old girl was really silent throughout almost the whole session. Towards the end, she says something. She says, "Is Daddy leaving because of the way I eat my crisps?" This little girl, Dad had had a hangover. She had eaten her crisps. It had sounded presumably like Krakatoa or something, with a hangover. He would shout at her. She would leave the room. She felt that Daddy was leaving because of the way she ate her crisps. So this is, His Majesty the baby. This is the self-centeredness of the human child. So think about that. So you think about this wound early on in life, where there's no pre-trauma personality. So you're sort of thinking it's all about me, I'm not good enough. And you start thinking that all these things are happening because developmentally that's how it works. So Bowlby, in all his attachment theory, what these guys were doing when they were investigating sort of attachment is they were dividing up what they called secure and insecure attachments, and they got a bit carried away, and there's all different types of secure attachments and all different types of insecure attachments. But what they do know, having done all the follow-up, is that actually, it's not so much what happens to you in life that throws you. It's actually how secure your beginnings are. It's a bit like the storm analogy. In a storm, the trees don't blow down but just because the wind is strong. The ones that blow down because the roots aren't strong enough to hold them up. It's the same sort of thing. So that we know that if you have secure... They did a lot of research with the Palestinian children in the refugee camps. Again, I'm not making any political comment, but actually, I'm sure you would all agree if your house is being bulldozed, it's a bit traumatic. That's all the only bit you need to grasp here. That actually, everybody thought, the psychologists thought, these kids, they're going to be in a real state, and they're giving interviews and banks of psychometric testing, and just really wholly expecting these kids to be really, distressed. They weren't. And they realized that the reason they weren't is because they had people around them who said, this shouldn't be happening. There was a secure base. There were people there who were saying, this shouldn't be happening, it's not normal, we're all in this together, we don't like it. Yeah? So think about that, and then think about being relinquished and adopted into a family that might not actually talk about it. Because actually talking about it might involve an enormous grief. It might involve talking about mum or dad's infertility. Not always. And I really generalise, because actually I really do believe that there are some people who are doing it for other reasons. And when I often Google myself on addiction and adoption, is to see, because actually what I used to do, I Googled addiction and adoption, and invariably I'm up there in the top 3. Do you know what the others are? Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. So me and Brad, because they're addicted to adoption. I don't know where I'm going now with them. Someone just take me back a minute or something. Attachment. Okay, well, okay, yeah. Roots. That's it. Exactly, the secure base, which is a Bowlby term actually, which is a term from attachment theory. If you have a secure base, actually you're going to be more resilient when the wind comes along. If your roots are attached, you're just going to be more resilient. So we know that these things, these early experiences, make an enormous amount of difference. And I'm going to. One of the functions of trauma, and it happens too up here for me, is that you may know that in trauma you lose the part of your brain that actually regulates time. Do you know it just goes? So I'm quite capable of thinking, I've only just started talking, and you're thinking, bloody hell, he's been going for 45 minutes. Here we have something that we're calling by the wrong name. We're calling it adoption. It's about relinquishment. There's not just one relinquishment. Everything we know about child development tells us that early trauma has an enormous impact on brain function, brain development, and on neurotransmitters, particularly serotonin, cortisol, and adrenaline. Okay? We know that those things are what also is associated with real traumas. There is a trauma, and actually, like a plant that's trying to grow up around a stone, actually it has to adapt. The child has to adapt. So in a sense, we're talking about adaptation, not adoption. Yeah? We're talking about something that is associated with enormous amounts of grief for everybody involved. Really, as I say, my experience of the birth mothers who do turn up in treatment, really traumatised, often very young, often persuaded to do something that they didn't really want to do, often regretting it. We're talking about adoptive families who often can't live without having a child, have an enormous grief that can't actually be faced, and a sense that maybe this would fix it. So we're talking about a trauma. We're talking about a trauma that can't be recalled but can be remembered, that repeats itself later in life. There is a compulsion to repeat. There is a whole sense for adoptees, which is why the sex and love addiction is so prevalent, particularly as an addiction amongst this population, desperately trying to hunger for attachment that has them acting against their best interests, just desperate to bond, but in a way, but the need is so high it could never happen. So actually, and very often you get the partners say, God, I just don't know, I can't do it. What you want is something that I just can't provide. There's enormous hunger for attachment. So we have a trauma that can't be remembered, that's played out, that is played out with anxiety and shame and fear and real catastrophic thinking, that the next thing that goes wrong will be the end of the world. Not just this thing going wrong, but somehow, actually, I'm on the streets and everybody knows it's my fault, and, it's the end of the world. And we're talking about a trauma that by definition has no pre-trauma personality. So that the sufferer believes that actually the person they've adapted to become is actually who they are. And that's not the case. That is not the case. Because they're unable to remember a time when they could drive on the M25, and it was cool. And I think what I want to suggest, I guess what I'm also saying, is that addiction and adoption will really go together, particularly as people are given up for substance misuse reasons, but also because if addiction is genetically proposed and environmentally disposed, there is an enormous wound at the beginning of life. And I want to suggest that most people, I can't say all because I don't know all adoptees, but most people who have been relinquished will at some point need to see themselves as having a co-occurring disorder of both addiction and, I suggest, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I do not think it will be long until adoption or relinquishment is seen as, and will be put in the journals and will be seen as developmental PTSD. And it's a trauma. The other thing is about this is that trauma is stored in the limbic system, as you probably know. The limbic system kicks in nanoseconds before the frontal cortex. It's the limbic system that when the man-eating tiger enters the room gets you to run before you say, I say, what a nice specimen. Yeah? That's what happens. That's why we have it. It's the limbic system that deals with trauma. Fight, flight, freeze, okay? Now, the problem is, if you've had an early trauma, which is why I meet a lot of people, and they say, God, some people say, I think I'm schizophrenic. Because people end up in almost like two minds. I really want this, but I really don't want this. I can't decide. Enormous amounts of ambivalence too in this population. Real difficulties making a decision, because decisions are life-threatening. If I decide to do this, and actually the real task for the therapist, those of you who are therapists, never give in when somebody asks you for advice, because what will happen is they'll say that's great, and they'll come back next week and say, you bloody told me to do this and it wasn't the right thing to do. Yeah? I think actually for therapists, and the biggest challenge is to stay quiet, actually, most of the time. I'm sure therapists would say far more than they need to. Well, it's just that actually the problem is the limbic system will kick in. So actually in a situation which is why you get the catastrophic thinking. Because actually here I get some envelope, I haven't seen the writing before, it's all there. It's the limbic system says, something unknown going to be rejected. Before someone can say, oh, nice handwriting, let's read the letter, wonder what the news is. It's kicking in nanoseconds before. It's when the boyfriend or the girlfriend says, actually, I think I'm going to stay at home tonight, let's not meet up. It's the limbic system that kicks in and thinks, she just wants to get rid of me. This is it. It's all over now. Yeah? It's the limbic system that does that just goes straight to the catastrophe. There will be another abandonment, rather than, actually, maybe she needs to do her nails, or perhaps he needs to go and hang out with his mates. Because actually I'm sorry, because I just get carried away here. But in relationship, in couples work, when you're doing couples work, this is the biggest problem. Because if you've had an attachment wound, one of the things you haven't managed to do is to become a separate person. Because actually what happens is you have an attachment wound and you spend your time trying to work out what you have to do to be accepted here. And the thing about being able to be separate, I don't mean a separation as in abandoning someone, to be a separate person, to be that is, any successful relationship actually exists in separateness. When you do couples counselling and you say to, when do you find him attractive, or when do you find her attractive, what they'll say to you is that, actually, I went to his office and I saw him giving a talk, and God, really turned me on. Because actually, he was doing something different. Or he'll say, I came home early and she was playing with the kids in the garden, and I saw a part of her I'd never seen, and I just really, the erotic exists in the space between the two, okay? Because you can't find someone attractive unless you're a complete narcissist. You can't find somebody attractive who is exactly like you, just trying to sort of fit in and be everything you want, they think that you might want them to be. So the real challenge in relationship for the adopted population is to be themselves, is to be myself in relationship. That is the challenge, because unless you can do that, you can't be attractive. But it's very hard to do that, because everything in the limbic system is saying, don't. There's going to be an emergency. Look around, make sure you're going to be safe. There's lots more that could be said. I really hope this makes some sense to some of you, and you haven't zoned out for too long and thought about your dinner. Thank you very much indeed.